In a small, tranquil town where the evenings were bathed in the golden hues of a setting sun, Mrs. Eleanor Hayes lived a quiet life in her cozy home at the end of a tree-lined street. At 78, Eleanor embraced her solitude with grace, spending her days tending to her vibrant rose garden and enjoying the comforting rhythm of her routines. By her side was Max, her loyal German shepherd, whose calm presence brought her both joy and security. To the casual observer, Max appeared to be just a devoted pet, but his past told a different story. Max was a retired police K-9, trained to face danger and protect without hesitation. Though his badge was long since retired, his sharp instincts remained intact, and he had seamlessly transitioned from a life of action to one of quiet companionship. For Eleanor, Max was more than just a dog. He was her guardian, her confidant, and her truest friend. As the soft glow of dusk settled over the neighborhood, Eleanor sipped her tea on the porch, unaware of the subtle shift in the air. Beyond the garden fence, hidden in the shadows of the growing night, an unseen presence stirred, a threat that neither she nor Max yet knew was closing in. As the sun dipped below the horizon and cast the neighborhood into the soft shadows of dusk, a faint rustling broke the stillness near Mrs. Eleanor Hayes's fence. Unnoticed by her, several figures moved cautiously along the edges of her property, their footsteps muffled on the grass. These weren't neighbors out for an evening stroll. These were intruders, a group of men who had chosen her home as their next target. They spoke in low whispers, gesturing toward the house with confidence, clearly believing they had picked an easy mark. After all, what threat could a kind, elderly woman living alone possibly pose? Inside, Eleanor moved about her home, unaware of the growing danger outside. She hummed softly as she cleaned up her tea set and prepared for her usual quiet evening. Max, her German shepherd, lay stretched out on the floor near her feet, his ears occasionally twitching as if catching sounds too subtle for human ears. While to the intruders, the dog was just a harmless pet, Max was already beginning to sense something was wrong. Outside, the men planned their move. "This'll be quick," one of them muttered, his tone filled with overconfidence. Another nodded in agreement, pointing to the back door as their entry point. Their plan was simple: break in, grab valuables, and leave before anyone even knew they were there. They hadn't accounted for Max, or his years of training. As they began moving closer to the house, the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel caught Max's attention. His head lifted, and his body tensed. His ears swiveled, pinpointing the direction of the sound. Eleanor glanced down at him and smiled, mistaking his alert posture for curiosity at some harmless outdoor noise. "It's probably just a squirrel," she said softly, patting his head. But Max didn't relax. His instincts, honed from years of working in high-pressure situations, told him that something more serious was afoot. Outside, the robbers were now just steps away from the house, their shadows barely visible in the fading light. Oblivious to the danger they were walking into, they moved with the confidence of predators approaching easy prey. What they didn't realize was that inside, behind the seemingly quiet walls of the house, an old but formidable guardian was already preparing to confront them. The faint sound of a twig snapping outside the window sent Max into motion. His ears were upright, his body tense, and his eyes fixed on the source of the sound. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, still unaware of the intruders, looked at him with mild concern. "What is it, Max?" she asked, her voice calm but curious. Max didn't respond in the way a typical pet might. Instead, he moved toward the door with deliberate precision, his body low to the ground, every movement purposeful. Outside, the robbers had split up. One approached the back door while another circled toward the side of the house, attempting to find an easier way in. Their overconfidence blinded them to the subtle warning signs, the faint growl that began to rumble from Max's throat, or the sharp intelligence in his eyes as he assessed the situation. Max positioned himself near the back door, his focus unwavering. Inside, Eleanor began to feel uneasy. She stepped toward the window, peering out into the darkness. but the dim light of her porch lamp revealed nothing unusual. "Must be the wind," she muttered to herself, trying to brush off the creeping sense of discomfort. But Max was not convinced. His movements became more focused, his breathing steady and controlled. He wasn't just reacting, he was preparing. The intruder at the back door jiggled the handle, testing to see if it was locked. When it didn't budge, he pulled a small tool from his pocket, confident it wouldn't take long to force it open. As he worked, he didn't notice Max's shadow slowly creeping closer to the door. The retired K9 stood completely still, his muscles coiled like a spring ready to release. Then came the first sound that signaled all was not going according to plan. Max let out a low, menacing growl, a warning, deep and primal, that seemed to vibrate through the air. The robber froze, his head snapping up in confusion. Before he could react, Max let out a sharp, thunderous bark that pierced the silence of the night. Inside, Eleanor jumped at the noise, her heart racing as she realized something was wrong. The men outside panicked. "What was that?" one of them hissed, looking toward the house. The man at the back door stumbled backward, fumbling with his tools. But Max didn't back down. He barked again, louder this time, his voice a clear challenge. The men, startled by the unexpected threat, began to rethink their plan. One of them whispered, "It's just a dog. We can handle a dog." What they didn't realize was that Max wasn't just a dog. He was a trained officer, skilled in reading threats and controlling situations. And tonight, he wasn't going to let anyone harm his owner. The sharp bark from Max shattered the night's stillness, sending the robbers into a flurry of whispered panic. "What is going on with that dog?" one of them muttered, glancing nervously toward the house. But before they could regroup or decide their next move, Max had already taken control of the situation. With a sudden burst of energy, he charged toward the back door, his powerful body colliding with it just hard enough to send a warning thud reverberating through the house. The man at the door, startled, stumbled backward and nearly dropped his tools. Inside, Eleanor's heart raced as she watched Max's behavior. She had never seen him act this way before. "Max, what's going on?" she whispered, but he was too focused to respond. Instead, he moved like a seasoned professional, scanning the windows and doors for any signs of the intruders. His growls grew louder, sharper, and more deliberate, as if daring anyone to come closer. Outside, the robbers weren't ready to give up. "It's just a dog," one of them said, trying to sound confident. "We can deal with this." But as they regrouped near the side of the house, they made their first critical mistake. They underestimated Max. The men crept toward a side window, thinking it might be an easier entry point. One of them raised a crowbar, preparing to break the glass. But before he could swing, Max was already there. His powerful frame appeared like a shadow in the dim light, and with another deafening bark, he lunged at the window, his teeth bared and his eyes blazing with determination. The impact of his paws against the glass was enough to send the men stumbling back in fear. "Okay, that's not just any dog," one of the robbers hissed, his voice trembling now. The men were visibly shaken, their earlier confidence crumbling with every move Max made. One of them tried to test the back door again, but as soon as his hand touched the handle, Max darted to the door, growling louder than ever. The sound was low and menacing, a clear warning that sent a shiver down the man's spine. Inside, Eleanor grabbed her phone with shaky hands and dialed 911. "There are intruders trying to break into my house," she said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. "My dog is keeping them at bay, but please hurry." The dispatcher assured her that officers were on their way, but Eleanor's faith wasn't in the arrival of the police, it was in Max. Meanwhile, outside, the robbers were running out of options. Every time they tried to approach the house, Max was there, blocking their path with barks that seemed to echo into the night. One of the men, now visibly frustrated, muttered, "How is this dog everywhere at once?" But Max wasn't just everywhere. He was one step ahead. Years of training had honed his ability to anticipate threats, and tonight, Those instincts were on full display. For the robbers, what had started as an easy job had turned into a nightmare. And for Max, this wasn't just another night. It was a mission, and failure was not an option. The robbers, now frantic and desperate, began shouting at each other in hushed tones. "This is ridiculous! It's just a dog!" one hissed, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear. Another, gripping a crowbar tightly, muttered, "We need to get out of here before someone calls the cops." But before they could decide their next move, Max made his own. As one of the intruders crept along the side of the house, trying to find another way in, Max silently repositioned himself. With practiced precision, he waited until the man stepped close enough, then leaped at the window, his bark thunderous and relentless. The man fell back, startled, dropping his crowbar with a loud clang. "I'm out," he stammered, scrambling to his feet and running toward the yard's edge. Inside, Eleanor watched in awe as Max moved from door to window, his every action calculated and precise. She clutched her phone tightly, listening for the sound of approaching sirens. "Good boy, Max," she whispered under her breath, her voice filled with gratitude and pride. Outside, the remaining robbers, still determined to salvage the job, decided to make a break for the back door. "We can overpower it," one said, his voice shaking as much from fear as frustration. But as soon as they stepped onto the porch, Max was waiting. He charged at the door, his bark sharp and relentless, his body pressed against the frame as if daring them to try. "What kind of dog is this?" one of the robbers shouted, his nerves unraveling. The leader, trying to keep control, snapped back, "It doesn't matter, just go." But as they turned to flee, they heard the sound they had been dreading. Sirens, loud and clear, growing closer with every passing second. Max didn't let up, continuing to bark and growl, ensuring the robbers couldn't regroup. The first police car arrived, its lights flashing red and blue across the yard. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn, and immediately took control of the scene. "Hands up! Don't move!" an officer shouted as the robbers froze, their escape now impossible. One by one, they were cuffed and escorted to the patrol cars, their earlier bravado completely gone. Inside, Eleanor let out a shaky breath as relief washed over her. She opened the door cautiously, and Max ran to the porch, his tail wagging but his eyes still scanning the yard. The officers approached, smiling as they recognized the retired K-9. Well, if it isn't Max," one officer said with a chuckle, kneeling down to pat him on the head. "Looks like you haven't lost your touch, old buddy." Max barked softly, his demeanor finally relaxing as he looked back at Eleanor, as if to say, "Mission accomplished." The officers reassured Eleanor that the robbers were in custody and commended her for having such a capable guardian. "You're lucky to have him," one officer said, tipping his hat. Eleanor smiled, her eyes glistening. "I know," she said softly, reaching down to stroke Max's fur. "He's my hero." The chaotic night finally gave way to calm as the police cars disappeared down the street, their sirens fading into the distance. Eleanor stood on her porch, gazing out at the quiet yard, now illuminated by the soft glow of her porch light. Max sat by her side, his head held high, his eyes alert but calm. The danger was gone, and he had ensured it stayed that way. Eleanor knelt down beside Max, her hands gently stroking his fur. "You were incredible tonight," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Max looked up at her, his eyes warm and steady, as if he understood every word. He had been more than just a companion tonight. He had been a protector, a guardian, and a reminder of the unbreakable bond they shared. The events of the night spread quickly through the neighborhood. By the next morning, neighbors stopped by to check on Eleanor and hear the story of how her loyal dog had thwarted the intruders. "I always knew Max was special," one neighbor said with a smile. Eleanor nodded, her pride evident. "Special doesn't even begin to describe him," she replied, glancing down at Max, who wagged his tail softly, content to bask in the attention. News of the attempted robbery and Max's heroics even reached the local police department. Officers who had worked with Max during his canine days stopped by to see their old partner. "Still as sharp as ever," one officer remarked, giving Max a hearty pat. Eleanor chuckled. "He's retired, but it seems like he hasn't forgotten a thing." That evening, as the house settled into its usual peaceful rhythm, Eleanor sat on her porch with a cup of tea. Max lay at her feet, his breathing steady and calm, his job done. She gazed at the stars twinkling in the night sky and felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for Max's actions that night, but for the years of companionship he had given her. "You've always been my hero, Max," she said softly, her voice carrying into the quiet night. Max lifted his head, his ears perking up at her voice, and wagged his tail. It wasn't just his training or his strength that had made him a hero. It was his love for her, a love that she knew would protect her always. In that moment, Eleanor realized that while the world outside could be unpredictable and dangerous, she would never truly feel alone. Max was more than just a retired police dog. He was her partner, her friend, and her unwavering guardian. As the days passed, life slowly returned to normal for Eleanor and Max. The neighborhood, once shaken by the events of that fateful night, had regained its calm. But for Eleanor, everything felt just a little bit brighter. She found herself appreciating the quiet moments with Max even more, knowing that his loyalty and protection had kept her safe when she needed it most. Max, however, was content to slip back into his usual routine. His walks around the neighborhood were leisurely, his time spent lounging on the porch peaceful. Yet every time someone knocked on the door or stopped to chat, they would ask about the night the robbers came and Max's heroic actions. Eleanor would smile and recount the story, never tiring of hearing how Max had saved the day. But what stood out to Eleanor most was the way Max seemed to carry himself after the incident. There was no cocky strut, no change in his demeanor. He was just Max, her companion, her protector, her friend. His actions had spoken for themselves, and he didn't need praise or recognition. He had done what he was trained to do, what he was born to do: protect those he loved. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch together, Eleanor reflected on how lucky she was. She had always known Max was special, but after everything that had happened, she understood just how extraordinary he truly was. He had saved her life that night, but more importantly, he had given her peace of mind every single day they had spent together. "I'm so proud of you, Max," Eleanor whispered, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. Max responded with a soft, contented sigh, his tail thumping against the porch floor in appreciation. He might have been retired, but he was still as sharp and protective as ever. As the sun began to set and the sky turned a beautiful shade of purple, Eleanor and Max sat together in companionable silence. The world outside could be unpredictable, even dangerous, but for Eleanor, there was no doubt in her heart that as long as Max was by her side, she would always be safe. He was more than just a retired police dog. He was family. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet of the evening, Eleanor felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Max had been her hero, not just that night, but every day. And she knew, no matter what the future held, she would never have to face it alone.